We want to talk today about the lawsuit that the Students for Fair Admission, or SFFA, had against the United States Naval Academy that took place last year, and some of the takeaways from that lawsuit. Students for Fair Admission previously conducted a lawsuit against Harvard and the University of North Carolina, claiming that both of those institutions were using race in order to determine admissions. And so the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Students for Fair Admission and directed both Harvard and the University of North Carolina not to use race with admissions. However, there was a carve out in that Supreme Court ruling that said that service academies had a interest in still using race as part of an admissions criteria, right? And so in reaction to that Supreme Court carve out, Students for Fair Admission did a lawsuit against West Point, the Air Force Academy, and Naval Academy regarding the use of race with admissions. And so the first one to go to a hearing, I guess would be lack of a better word, since I'm not a lawyer, or neither are you, was a Naval Academy. And so we're not going to talk about however you come down on this issue about race and admissions. What we want to talk about today is some of the discovery material that was part of this, particularly from the director of admissions of the Naval Academy, that really gave an interesting snapshot into how the Naval Academy picks its candidates to be admitted, what that memo said, and some of the takeaways. Now, some of these things we already knew, other things were kind of reinforced. And then there were a few new things that we found interesting in this. There were some takeaways that we can definitely tell our candidates. The couple of things that really kind of stood out for me on this thing was, first of all, whole person multiple still works. That should be your focus. It's not like we suddenly upended the whole person multiple system, right? Permeating your application with STEM stuff. In other words, making sure that your major is engineering when they ask you what your preferred major is. And then you should mention in your applications, mention in your essays about how you love engineering and how you love STEM. If you haven't done anything with engineering yet, you should maybe get an activity that you're doing engineering or something like that, because that's clearly going to be given the additional points by the RAB, the recommendations of the admissions board. And then finally, I would say that given the shift away from race as a determining factor, there's this kind of coded word called challenging circumstances. If you do have a challenging circumstance, or one where you can think about that aspect, that may help you in admissions, because it's mentioned in a number of places. But when you look at minorities, particularly minorities who have had a history of racism, other things, disadvantages, one could argue that that's a challenging circumstance. So it's, how do you code that? Do you code that a race issue, or do you code that a issue about having a challenging circumstance? You can kind of work around that issue, and that can be something that could maybe be used by the Academy to work around any ruling that talks about racial preference.
Understanding exactly what you're talking about, sir, with understanding that the whole person multiple is 80,000 points and 9,000 of that is subjective. And like you said, it comes down to STEM. I just want to clarify that you're not locked into that major. So you could talk about engineering and then change your major to English.
That's exactly right. After me, that'd be a history major, right? As they say. So 9,000 out of 80 is like 10%.
Exactly. Like the fact that they even mention the specific instances of what they're looking for. So the dean mentions leadership positions with measurable impact, overcoming significant adversity or hardship, life experiences or cultural backgrounds, first-generation college students or American status, significant employment responsibility, and language skills beyond English. So you should pay special attention to those to try and boost your whole person multiple as much as possible.
Yeah, and bring those out in your essays. So bring that out in the essays, bring them out in the extra boxes that they give you when you're talking about your leadership, describing that in more detail.
There is a question that directly asks, have you had any unique life experiences? Or do you belong to any cultural groups related to your cultural background? Depending on where you are in your high school career, even if you're a junior right now, you're able to project through the end of senior year.
Yeah. Well, what about, let's just say I'm an average white guy in Alabama or in Idaho. Can I create this? Can I create some of these things?
You could create something related to your heritage. You could join Daughters of the American Revolution, Sons of the American Revolution. There's opportunities for you there.
How about like going to a summer program in a place that has a diverse environment? How about going over to another country and experiencing another culture for a month over the summer to gain language proficiency? Not just studying for the AP test at your school, but realizing the things that are going to cause that RAB to give you those extra points, right? So I think even if you're not a person who's had these kind of experiences in your life, you can create those experiences.
A recent candidate that we worked with was fluent in Spanish. And so he went out and for a service project, he created a campaign to increase Hispanic and Spanish speaking voter registration in Southern California. That's a great example because that's a huge service to the nation, but also he was working on his Spanish skills at the same time.
That's awesome. It reminds me of a Peter Drucker quote. Peter Drucker was the father of modern management. And what he said was, the best way to predict the future is to create it. So what you do is you create your future. Your future is being accepted to the Naval Academy by understanding what they're asking for and getting into the academy and then creating those experiences that allow you to get the higher scores that get you into the academy. So I think your description of those things, right, that will kind of move up and down, the recommendations of the admissions board is important. Can you just roll through those one more time? I think they're really important.
Yeah, let's talk through them one by one because I have some questions about what some of these mean that we should talk about. So the first one is leadership positions with measurable impact. And I think this is such a key, because students love to put like, oh, I was team captain of the swim team. And that's a great leadership position. But what did you actually do? Were you the only senior and everyone on your team was basically a freshman? You sacrificed your time and you really spent extra time with everyone on your team and your brand new team made it to states that year. That's significant, meaningful impact. But just saying that you were team captain of the swim team doesn't really mean anything.
Right. Yeah. Because you don't really know what you've done. I mean, you can just be like, I know there's some teams that designate 7 or 8 captains on the team just to kind of check the box. And so what kind of meaningful things did you do as that team captains? Because each school handles team captains differently. One school that may be a significant designation, right? Where you may say, well, that doesn't need explanation. I mean, there's only one person out of 100 people on the team that are a captain. Well, Naval Academy doesn't know that, so you need to explain it.
Yeah, one team captain leading 30 team members. Peer selected captain wasn't the coach that chose me. And for every single area on the application where you're filling out all your extracurriculars, there is room and space. It's not a ton of space, but it's about 200 to 300 characters where you can go into detail. Right. So you need to use that space carefully to really hammer home that measurable impact.
Absolutely. So what's the next one?
Overcoming significant adversity or hardship.
All right. So let's see. I'm a person who has had a life that has had no hardship whatsoever when I'm initially asked. I've just been a high school student and I've been doing great, loving life.
I would even write out scholar athlete leader from your resume and I would figure out, okay, what are my scholar athlete leader qualities? And then where did I struggle with these? Where did I overcome something? Maybe you were injured in sports. You had to sit out on the sidelines or decide whether or not to stay on the team or commit to the team. That's a significant hardship for students to overcome.
Yeah, I would say maybe a financial setback with your household, where maybe you had to get an additional job or something to help your family with a layoff or something like that. So that could be another one. How about moving around a bit? Like typically military people have to move around, but maybe your parents had to move a number of different places, right? And you had to make new friends or have new experiences in order to do that. So all of those are challenges. So you got to really sit down and kind of think about those a little bit more to be able to see what is challenging for me. So yeah. So other thoughts?
If you have an illness or injury in your family too, and you're taking care of a family member, we've worked with candidates who are like, oh, I've never encountered adversity before. Then they tell me that, oh, I have to leave this meeting 15 minutes early. And I'm like, oh, why do you have to leave? Well, oh, I'm cooking food for my cousin because they got sick and they've been sick the last 6 months. And so it's my responsibility to go over there and make sure that everything is good. I'm like, this is a family hardship.
How about taking care of your grandmother or grandfather? End of life issues with a grandparent. How about taking care of a neighbor who needs it? How about this? If you can't think of anything, start helping somebody who's challenged. Step up. And maybe there's a aunt you have or a neighbor or a relative who's going through a difficult situation. Maybe you can step up and help that person and take that on and be a person that gives. It may be stressful, but it's challenging. So what I mean is you got to create these kind of things. If you can't think of it, first of all, I think the point you're making is you got to sit down and think about them, right? But if you don't have anything, there's so much suffering in this world that you can alleviate.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it goes back to the core values of the Navy: honor, courage, and commitment.
Right.
Having all three of those core values to, just like you're going to be taking care of your sailors and Marines one day, why not start now and look around your local community and see who needs it? The next example is unique life experiences or cultural backgrounds.
Creating that either you have it or you need to create it in some way, shape, or form by helping others, by making a decision to experience that in more depth, making it more than just a vacation drive-by, being truly immersing yourself in a different cultural or different situation. Let me give you an example. You can go for 4 or 5 weeks to Guatemala or to Costa Rica and go to a language school there and immerse yourself in a foreign language for a month and a half and actually immerse yourself in a foreign culture. So, I mean, there's opportunities to do that. And in the US, you can immerse yourself in another culture or try to make those connections that show, right, that you understand others.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. The next one is first generation college student or American status, and then significant employment responsibility. And this one, sir, I love that example that you have of a student who worked at Target.
Yeah, it's an awesome example that I oftentimes use for people that I talk to about this. So this was a candidate who was the manager of the frozen food section of a Target. And he was like 18 years old. He had 30-year-old adults working for him and he was managing them. What happened one evening, the power went out. And so the manager calls this 18-year-old and says, we've got to save the frozen food. You got to figure out what to do. So he goes and he figures out how to rent a generator. And then he rents a generator and saves the frozen food, $1 million worth of frozen food for Target, being his responsibility to do that. And so this is an 18-year-old obviously managing those, and you can talk about the difficulty of managing somebody who's practically twice your age, having those types of responsibilities, right? That show that adults are putting you in positions of responsibility. That is, and you can articulate that. It's just so much more impactful than just doing another AP course. I mean, it's one of these things where, yeah, these AP courses are great and studying and doing some of these other things are great also. But if you can show that kind of responsibility, I think that's another thing that they're looking for.
And it just goes beyond even team captain. I mean, a lot of students wonder, is it good for me to have a job? And the answer is yes, because like you said, it's real world, real life experience.
Exactly right. So is that what, did we exhaust the list there?
The final one is language skills beyond English.
We talked about how you can sort of obtain those language skills over through immersion, through maybe intense study. That's going to be important. So we kind of covered that. But obviously, if you're a native speaker of a foreign language, that certainly sounds like it can advantage your application. The naval officer careers are highly technical, right? You got to run nuclear reactors. You got to do all the mechanical things that are involved with being a great naval officer. They're interested in having people say in their application that they're interested in being engineers. So you'll have a part of your application where you'll say, what major do you want to do? And you'll definitely want to, that even if you don't say you want to do an engineering major, because that's going to help on the application. Also, you want to have experiences where you show your interest in engineering. So there's tons of things that you can do over the summers or during the academic year that you're doing engineering projects, maybe a course at your school that you're doing with engineering, maybe an outside activity where you have to do things with engineering. Maybe you have a relative or a friend or a neighbor that is an engineer that can get you some experience at their work where you work on an engineering project. There's just so many opportunities where you can demonstrate your interest in engineering. The more you can do that on your application, the more that you can show a genuine interest in engineering, it's going to help your application.
Without a doubt, that's definitely what Navy is looking for, whether you're looking at the Naval Academy or Navy ROTC, they want engineers.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really why a Navy ROTC, 70% or 80% of their scholarships are people who designate STEM majors, because as was mentioned by Captain Roberts in some of the previous podcasts he's done with us, when explaining Navy ROTC, he says that Navy ROTC was almost designed to produce nuclear engineers and other types of engineers that can handle and supervise the equipment on naval vessels. And then, of course, the Naval Academy also has to produce those individuals. So it's part of the mission of the Navy. Now, Marine Corps separate, right, from that, but the Naval Academy falls under that same category as Navy ROTC. So say STEM anywhere you can in your application.
Yeah, it was fascinating to read through, and we'll post the F so you can read through and see the Dean of Admissions words straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But I think there's a couple key things to take away, and that's the recommendations of the admissions board and what matters and what doesn't matter, which we'll break down in further discussion here. The role of recruited athletics within the Naval Academy, and also the congressional nomination process and the nomination process in general for the Naval Academy, and some takeaways there as well.
Let's talk about blue chip or recruited athletes here. This is an interesting part that a lot of times candidates don't understand, is that the Academy has to field Division I athletics across all of its sports. Blue chip recruited athletes are about 20% of the class, about 240 midshipmen total. And those recruited athletes that the Academy really wants is close to about 100% admissions rate for blue chip athletes to get into the Naval Academy. And to my mind, Trish, just shows how much of a class is reserved for recruited athletes. And I think there's, other than the other academies, meaning West Point and the Air Force Academy, I don't think there's any other college in the country that has a high number of percentage recruited athletes than service academies do.
That's pretty good odds right there.
If you're a recruited athlete and they want you at the Naval Academy, they're going to find a way to get you in. And interestingly, the waivers also, they'll medically waiver blue chip recruited athletes that they wouldn't necessarily waiver non-athletes. So that includes the whole admissions process to include medical waivers. So just we knew this already. We've done a previous podcast on this, kind of doing a deep dive on West Point, but this reaffirms that close to 240 midshipmen, or about 20% of the class, are recruited athletes.
If there's even a chance that you could be recruited, that you can get in contact with the coaches early, sophomore, junior year, and get in contact with those coaches. Because the reality is, even if you are not a blue chip athlete, if you have a relationship with a coach, that can influence admissions as well. And it can also influence your ability to get a waiver. Let's say this candidate is not a blue chip athlete, but if you admit them, I will absolutely have them on the baseball team, or whatever the case may be. So it really gives admissions, it gives you a better shot at being appointed.
Yeah, absolutely. Great takeaway there. A lot of times I'll tell candidates we work with that if you're a blue chip athlete or they want you, generally you'll know it for the most part. But there certainly could be those cases where the coach could certainly help you along those lines. Even though you wouldn't be, say, a recruited athlete, they may be able to put something in your file that would help you in that regard. So that's the first thing I'd say would be the recruited, blue chip or recruited athletes. That was reaffirmed. The second thing that I know we've talked about, Trish, also is prep school, right? Prep school is either the Naval Academy Prep School, which is called NAPS, or what we call the private prep program that has scholarships to selected colleges or universities. So that's about 13% of the admits total, about 156 midshipmen. 95% of Naval Academy prep schoolers are admitted, and 97% of private prep school programmers are admitted. So close to about 100%. That is another ticket for admission to the Naval Academy.
And when we look at those programs like Greystone, Northwestern Prep, Mexico Military Institute, they have such a high acceptance rate. But if you are not in the foundation program, which is that scholarship program, These are very expensive schools to pay for out of pocket. So that's
Mhm.
something that you have to consider. Some of these schools are over $50,000 a year. So the foundation program really helps because they look at its needs based and they help offset some of that cost. Financial concerns have to be taken into consideration as well. And perhaps this is why you would apply for a Navy ROTC scholarship and pursue Navy ROTC for a year and then reapply to the Naval Academy from a
Mhm.
financial perspective if you are not offered a prep school slot at NABS or a foundation program slot.
Yep, absolutely. So, Tricia, if we add up the 240 midshipmen that are recruited athletes, and then we add in the other, and then we add in the 156 midshipmen that are admits from the prep school or prep programmers, and then the other 100 candidates that come in under what we call the service connected, being sons or daughters of retired or actively serving service members. Around 40% or a little bit higher of the admitted class is under categories that most people probably listening to this podcast don't even compete in. When you talk about all of this and you say, well, I'm not a recruited athlete and I'm not connected to the service or the prep school, then you're competing for those other 55% of the admissions that isn't based upon being either prep school, service connected, or recruited athletes. So it kind of gives you an idea how the pool of high schoolers who are not recruited athletes have to compete. So of that 55%, maybe high schoolers that are competing, they could be high schoolers, but they could be in their first year of college, right?
Mhm.
And so if you're a high schooler, then you're narrowing down even more the number of people that are actually being selected coming out of high school that are not recruited athletes, not in their first year of college, not a prep school or service connected through being the son or daughter of either retired or actively serving military officer or NCO.
It's probably closer to 500 slots for high school students.
Yeah, I'd say that that sounds about right to me, about 500. So not a lot when you consider that. And one of the takeaways that I wanted to that I mentioned, I know it's been brought up in previous times that we've talked about this, is that but understanding when you take a look at like the average SAT score for the Naval Academy or West Point or the Air Force Academy, you'll see this average number of 1,300 or 1,350 or something like that. What you got to understand is a lot of that number is being kind of dragged down a bit by your recruited athletes, your prior service, your Naval Academy prep schoolers and others. So that means that the 500 slots you're competing for, you've got to be that much higher in your SAT scores in order to win one of those slots.
Yeah, absolutely. And what is that number to be safe?
It's
I would push again for that 750 math SAT score or a 34 math on the ACT, and then at least a 700 for verbal or a 62 combined for English and reading for the ACT.
right. And notice the importance of the math score, which is 60%, which we think is 60% of the overall SAT. So obviously an emphasis on math, and that shouldn't be surprising given the emphasis of engineering and hard science at the academies. We would say at West Point, we'd say beat the dean when we would do our finals. So I know we've talked about how the Naval Academy ignores your principal nominee, but if we look at the testimony of the dean at Naval Academy, he or she claims that they will accept the primary nominee from a congressional district as long as they meet the bottom line academic, athletic, meaning passing the candidate
Yeah,
fitness assessment and are medically qualified. But we've seen anecdotally that not to be the case.
I have a candidate right now who was awarded a principal nomination from a senator and he was waitlisted.
Right. Which, I mean, and we saw a example of that last year too. So there seems to be some question marks about that, but that's sort of anecdotal stuff, but not part of what the report from the dean mentions, right? So what I want to do is go back and talk about the ways in you can be admitted to the academy from the congressional sources, right? So there's sort of three ways that you can do this. You can be admitted through what we call you win the congressional slate, which each member of Congress gets one slot, usually, right, to the academy each year. Sometimes if they don't have four people at the academy at that particular time, it can be more than one, but usually it's one for each member of Congress. So that's winning the congressional slate. And it's usually one person. So each member of Congress, just do the math. Each member of Congress, each member of the House, each member of the Senate, the vice president, and then some of the territories. And what's the number again, Trish? 541. Okay, good. All right. Then there's other ways you can get in that we'll just go through briefly, which is called qualified alternate or Q. That is the top 200 based on the whole person multiple. And then the additional appointee, which the dean said about 266 of those are at the discretion of the Naval Academy. The factors that we talked about for the recommendations of the admissions board, you can admit people under the additional appointee applied to that, such as challenging life circumstances. A lot of recruited athletes come off of A, things like that. What was interesting that came out of this report was something, a little bit of a wrinkle to this, which was the role of the slating committee, right? So there's a slating committee at the Naval Academy as part of the admissions that determine what category a person gets their appointment from. So the slating committee can decide to move a person, say, who won their congressional slate, can move them based on their whole person multiple to a qualified alternate, right? And then they can direct lower whole person multiple candidates to win the congressional slate. So maybe you can explain that in more comprehensible English than I just did.
Sure, sir. I think it means that the slating committee has a lot of flexibility when it comes to the nomination, and that at the end of the day, for your member of Congress, nominate students. Your whole person multiple is the most important thing because it's what you have control over. You aren't going to be able to control whether or not you win the district, but you can push up your whole person multiple as high as possible to try and win one of those qualified alternate slots. As far as the AA slots go, you can follow those guidelines that we discussed from the board to try and showcase why you should be selected as a midshipman. But at the end of the day, that's subjective. The best thing to do is focus on your whole person multiple.
Right. And it shows you that the Naval Academy can make a decision to have somebody win a congressional slate. They have a lot of flexibility to do that. For example, if a member of Congress nominates by the competitive method, what's supposed to happen is the person with the highest whole person multiple is supposed to win the congressional slate based upon guidance given by congressional legislation. If the people say they have the winner of the district and they determine that person would qualify as a qualified alternate, they could shift that person who won the congressional slate to the qualified alternate and bring somebody up, maybe the second person that maybe has a lower whole person multiple that they want to win the congressional.
A game of Tetris that the Naval Academy can play to appoint who they want to appoint.
Yeah. And here's the other kicker here, right? So if the slate winner declines, so let's just say you have a person, they decide to make that person the slate winner and declines the appointment. He said the Naval Academy is now not bound by the whole person multiple to select the replacement, according to documents that we have. So that means they could reach down and choose number 11 on the whole person multiple to win the slate for that district. So a point there is that the Naval Academy can play, like you're saying, play Tetris and decide who wins the slate for that member of Congress. It may not be the person who has the highest whole person multiple. So the Naval Academy prep school applicants have one congressional slates on a much higher level with lower whole person multiples. And so that's kind of strange because the people who go to the Naval Academy prep school are either athletes or those who need additional academic help in order to be able to get an appointment. So what they're finding is how can these NAPS applicants who have lower WPMs win a congressional slate when there's clearly people who have higher whole person multiples who didn't win the slate? And that's because some of those people were shifted probably to QAs, right? And they were made QAs, even though they probably would have won the congressional slate. So winning your congressional slate may not mean what you think it is. You may not have certainly been the best person in your district.
I think it's also important to note that this is something that we see unique to the Naval Academy. And so far, we haven't seen a whole lot of evidence of this for the other academies. So when you're planning what to do and deciding, okay, what's my top branch of service, it's something to consider. And it's something to take into the decision. Are you going to apply to ROTC and reapply to the Naval Academy, or would you be happy to serve in another branch as well?
Exactly. And I think what it shows you is how much flexibility the Naval Academy has, where their hands are not necessarily tied to a whole person multiple exactly. So obviously, if you are in the top 200 of your whole person multiple, and you're in the top 200 qualified alternate, you're probably good to go. It's where you get into the gray area is if you don't have that high SAT or ACT score, there's nothing that stands out in your application. You have like a middle of the road WPM. You're not a recruited athlete. You're not a person who's has any life challenges, didn't say that they were interested in STEM. There's no reason for the Naval Academy to come down and pluck you out.
Really good point, sir. Really good perspective and way to frame it.
Here are my takeaways overall for this whole discussion here and what we learned from this lawsuit, right? One is that what you emphasized earlier, Trish, is whole person multiple should be your goal. You just need to continue to work your whole person multiple, make it the highest you possibly can, because the higher you get it, the better chance you are of getting in. Two, I would say, is understand that the average SAT scores or grades is not indicative of the class, as that average is dragged down by athletes, prep schoolers, and prior service people, right? So you've got to look at those SAT scores in the 700s or in the 32 or higher with a math score in the mid 700s or ACT score of math of 34. Third thing I would say is permeating your application with STEM activities, references, and the desires to want to do STEM. If you have challenging life circumstances, if leadership-wise, the things that we talked about that are going to go ahead and give you that extra 10% on the recommendations of the review of the admissions board of the RAB, that will increase your numbers, right? And that includes like challenging life circumstances, bringing those out in the essays. It's almost like you want to signal that in a number of ways in your application. If you don't have these things, you want to create them, right? In the time that you have remaining before you're selected. So creating experiences where you have these STEM activities, creating a challenging circumstance, right? By helping others, helping people that need it, experiencing other cultures or immersing yourself in other cultures and understanding other people, creating this future, right? Predicting you getting into the academy by creating this future that then allows you to be able to be selected and be the type of person that the Naval Academy is looking for.
Sir, what stands out to me is that everything that you just mentioned, it's about creating your future. It's about being not a passive participant, but taking deliberate action. Because if you just go along until senior year, likely this is not going to happen. You have to take very specific steps to mold yourself into the type of midshipman that the Naval Academy is looking for.
Yep. The earlier you can get a start on that, the better. The dean lays out exactly what you need to do in order to be successful. We need to take what the dean says at face value and create our future by creating it. So the challenges out there for everyone listening here today, we hope you take up the challenge because service to your country is important. And we need all the people we can to be great leaders for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guard, and merchant mariners.
And guardians.
And guardians too, absolutely. Looking forward to the next time.